This is Yesterzine, the show that scanned ahead to find out what today's gaming hell is, and is already regretting several of its life choices. We're getting ahead of ourselves though. This is the show where we take an architectural dig into the best and worst reviewed games from an old gaming magazine and use the evidence to reconstruct an entire Roman village somehow. For this episode, our magazine of choice is Mega, issue 17, a Sega Mega Drive specific magazine at this point owned by Future Publishing, and it's an interesting time in gaming. Our gaming heaven is, possibly unusually, on the Mega CD, and is from a genre that's essentially dead now and probably unfairly maligned? Or is it? And the gaming hell is, at least on a score basis, easily the worst thing we've ever covered on this show. It's so bad, I'm going to cover a semi-hell as well just to work up to it. So while I'm doing that, let's dive into this. Our cover feature this month is essentially the story of how our gaming heaven even happened. So we're going to mix up the order and do that first. We're going to talk about a unique and much derided gaming genre that burned bright for about 5 years and then effectively descended into near extinction. The interactive movie.
The guy you're replacing, he had that same tough guy smirk on his face that you do, till he hit the wall. They're out there now blotting him up with handy wipes. But the ghost here, I always come back for more.
You see, this is the time where storage capacity both started to, and ceased to be, a thing, depending on how you look at it. Up until now, our games were either on cassettes, with all the loading that implied, on floppy disks that on a good day stored 1.4 megabytes each, or, at the rich console end, on fearsomely expensive ROM cartridges, which, during the commercial life of the Mega Drive at least, topped out at around 5 megabytes, or 40 megabit. There were options. You could obviously compress certain assets, at the cost of then having to decompress them for use, of course. If you've ever wondered why a cartridge system needs to load, this is probably why. If you were a disk-based system like the Amiga, you could of course package a giant pile of disks. But the costs mount up, and in most game types you'd have your users swapping them so often that disk swapper's wrist was nearly an official medical condition. Then the early 90s came along, and CDs happened. CDs were cheap. Even early CD drives were 3 times the speed of floppy disks at 150 kilobytes a second. But more importantly, a CD stored 650 megabytes, the same as 130 of even the largest cartridge. To give you an idea, that's nearly 5 times the jump from CDs to a modern Blu-ray drive console. In one go. The first home CD-ROM gaming came along as early as 1988 with the CD-ROM add-on for NEC's PC Engine, also known as the TurboGrafx 16. It cost $400 as an add-on, and the only 2 games you could buy for it at the start were a port of the first Street Fighter, mystifyingly called Fighting Street. It took a game that a good number of you were probably not 100% certain even existed, and added a remastered soundtrack. And that's about it. The only other launch game was a port of Sega's Wonder Boy 3, which had a CD soundtrack, but you could argue didn't even look as good as the later Mega Drive cartridge version, albeit being a better match to the arcade game in terms of levels. Nonetheless, NEC claimed they sold 500,000 CD add-ons by March 1991, by which time the competition had turned up. The PC Engine never reached Europe, so first out of the Eurogate that very month was Commodore's CD-TV. It was based on an Amiga 500, but somehow cost £700, which was very quickly reduced to $500. It didn't have a floppy drive, keyboard or mouse, so you couldn't even use it as an Amiga. It looked like it should go under a TV, but it sold like shares in Thomas Cook. Commodore didn't help by later launching the considerably cheaper A570 CD drive that did everything a CD-TV could do if you already had an Amiga 500. And most of their audience did. Those who didn't have an A500 could certainly pick up one cheap and still be quids in too, because the A570 launched after the A500 had been replaced by the A600, a computer it was not compatible with. It also wouldn't work if you were the kind of person who owned Commodore's official hard drive add-on. Exactly the kind of thing an early adopter interested in CD would indeed already have. You could also buy an external floppy drive, keyboard, and mouse for the CD-TV if you wanted. If you wanted an ugly, shit A500 that was several times the size and cost the best part of £2,000 in today's money. I can't imagine why this whole thing failed. Philips took a punt with the CDI and made almost every single mistake Commodore did. It did, at least, give us a great pub quiz question. What was Sony's first games console? Most people will say the PlayStation. People who think they're clever will say this, which was also called a PlayStation, and which we'll be covering in an episode or two's time because it's a hell of a story. It wasn't released though, and so isn't the answer either. This is the answer. The Sony Intelligent Discman. A portable CDI. A machine whose popularity will simply let be described by the words super rare appearing 9 times in the first 4 rows of Google image results. Somehow, despite all this, Sega had a go, and in late 1991 in Japan they released the Mega CD, an add-on to the Mega Drive that retailed for a much more reasonable $300 when it hit the US the next year, and £270 in the UK at Easter 1993. It required a Mega Drive, sure, but there were many of those about, especially in English-speaking territories. And while not a runaway success, Sega would sell a couple of million of them, enough to support a decent range of games. But what to do with near unimaginable amounts of storage? We've talked about the lazy option before, simply doing a CD quality soundtrack and wang it out attached to what was basically just a Mega Drive game. And there were plenty of those. But one newly formed games company had a better idea. Video games with literal video.
Climb aboard, dog meat!
Digital Pictures wasn't formed to develop for Sega. In its original form, they'd come into existence years earlier to develop games for a VHS videotape-based console called the Nemo. Being developed by a team including such luminaries as Atari founder Nolan Bushnell and the second most famous Apple founder called Steve, Mr. Wozniak.
They call him Steve Wozniak, co-creator of the Apple Mac.
Hasbro had kicked in $7 million, and as early as 1986 they had something running. A 4-minute demo called Scene of the Crime. Based on this, 2 games were commissioned, and some of you will know where we're going with this when I say they were called Night Trap and Sewer Shark. The latter of which cost $3 million to develop, thanks in part to an incredibly complex system, where 4 tracks of video could be interleaved on a single tape, and the machine simply showed the one it needed, at a fairly serious resolution cost. The system was to be released in 1989, but 2 months from launch Hasbro got cold feet and withdrew, feeling they couldn't sell a console that would cost $300. Director and company founder Tom Zito bought the lot for a song and would sit on the idea for a couple of years. We fast forward to 1992, and then, because we're on VHS and overshot, rewind again to 1991. Tom still got his completed work, and Sega have a CD-based console coming. They contacted him, and ports of both Sewer Shark and Night Trap were commissioned. Sewer Shark, an on-rail shooter, was bundled with later CD units. Gameplay-wise, it's exactly that, an on-rails 3D tube shooter, of which there were a few by this point. The gimmick being the tube was entirely full-motion video with the enemies layered on top. It gave it a look Mega Drive games couldn't match, and being technically impressive but short-lived, it's absolutely the perfect thing to bundle with a console to both show what it could do, but also not stop people buying other games for it at some point. There's nothing here to draw you in now though, over their later games at least, so let's move on. Night Trap was somewhat different. A game in which you're a special agent keeping watch on a teenage girl's slumber party because there are some conventions we're damn well going to follow here. Your job is to switch between all the cameras and activate traps when danger appears. Danger mostly consisting of, and I invite you to remember the beginning of this paragraph at this point, vampires. It was a technical step forward and essentially formed the true interactive movie genre. It also more than used the space on a CD, in that it comes on 2 of them. Despite this, even then, magazines recognised it was shallower than a Trump gene pool, and its surprising, if B-movie violence, led both to the creation of the US Games Ratings Board and to Sega pulling the game from circulation. Nonetheless, in 25th anniversary form, you can play it today on all the current consoles. Times change.
Night Trap will never appear on a Nintendo system.
That's not the game in this issue though. By 1993, Digital Pictures had used their collection of old VHS footage and needed to film more. They had a couple of $1 million to play with, courtesy of royalties from the bundling of Sewer Shark with the Mega CD. And so, having charted how we get there, we move on to this episode's slightly surprising gaming heaven. The interactive movie shooter game, Ground Zero Texas.
South Texas, on the US-Mexican border. People have begun to disappear. Individuals, families, gone without a trace. All humanity is in danger. And this small Texas town sits at ground zero.
You can see why this wowed someone coming from floppy disk or cartridge games, can't you? It's a smidge low-res and fuzzy by today's standards, but this is entirely watchable. It's a several-minute, full-motion video introduction that's... well, it's not even that badly acted by B-movie standards.
I'll get him. Keep it running.
Yes, sir.
Good luck, buddy.
Name's Reese. I'm the agent in charge down here. We're real glad to see you. And we're running a little pushed on this thing, so try to keep up. This here's Pike.
So you're the new tactical expert. Right, hop in.
The game's scriptwriter Ken Melville was not so kind looking back about the decision to reduce the video to 64 colours and reduce the bitrate to make it suitable for Sega's single-speed CD drive.
All our video had to be tortured, kicking and screaming into the most horrifying, blurry, reduced colour palette mess imaginable in the Sega CD. I shudder to think about it.
Harsh, I'd say. The intro looks good and sets the scene for a situation where aliens can disguise themselves as people. You have to figure out who they are, and then do a shootings before the US government get bored and drop a tactical nuke on you. So it's a good thing this game wasn't set in 2019, because that'd take a minute and a half tops. Ground Zero Texas is, essentially, a light gun game without the light gun. Slightly charmingly naff movie scenes break out into shooting sections as the aliens reveal themselves, usually in obvious traditional light gun game set pieces, but also as people break character right in the middle of scenes to take a pot shot at you.
Let's see what you got, amigo. Baby, you're so clean, and you can perform surgery with them. No numbers, no traces, no problem. Big problem. Federal agents, on your knees, hands behind your head. Do it now!
It's a game where you have to have your wits about you. There are 4 cameras throughout the town, and you have to watch all of them, switching between them as items demand your attention. This is a mechanic essentially borrowed from their other games, and it's down from the 8 that Night Trap used. That was overwhelming at times though, and with the scenes far more interactive than in that game, it's also probably about the right number as you hop between Main Street, the cantina, a local hotel, and the Plaza Square. As your camera gets close to dying, then you get some cool video effects. Firstly, flashing black and white, and then eventually the kind of pixelization and corruption that I'm honestly surprised they had the processor cycles to pull off. The gun doesn't work on humans, so the only penalty for wrong shot is loss of ammo, which helps because this certainly isn't the easiest of games. These sections also give themselves away a bit, as it repeats actors, and while you could suggest the aliens are working from a library, there's only one death animation per actor. Neatly, they cover this in the intro by saying your weapon can only stun the aliens. Lose too much, and that bomb gets dropped, which is pretty effective as end sequences go.
Hey, how's the
I like this. You can see why this genre was a popular arcade game for a long time, with titles such as Mad Dog McRae. By having the unfolding plot, over nearly 2 hours of video, Ground Zero Texas is at least a smidge deeper than those titles. Whether it was worth a full price purchase even then, I'm not sure, although, if you were showing off your shiny new Sega CD to your mates, then this would certainly do that job, even over games like Sonic CD that were objectively much better. In 2019? Ground Zero Texas is not a hugely expensive title to pick up if you want to play it on original hardware, and taken as an evening-long arcade-style experience, I really liked it. You very quickly stop noticing the video quality. I'm not going to pretend this is your new favourite game by any stretch of the imagination, but this is a genuinely engaging little arcade shooter. It's a genre with an awful reputation, and not an undeserved one, but there's absolutely fun to be had here, and the short-lived nature of this type of game means it's one of a very few, and a very different experience to much made today. And if that doesn't convince you, watch for a very early appearance by Danny Trejo, a decade before gamers discovered him with his role in Vice City, and nearly 2 decades before Robert Rodriguez made him a star in Machete. Digital Pictures didn't last long after this. The appearance of the 32 bits meant that real-time 3D worlds became much more of a thing, and pre-rendered video footage was emphasised a lot less. Digital Pictures didn't adapt. They threw in the towel in 1996, selling the remains to a company called Cyber Cinema, who had grand plans to release the games on DVD. All they actually did was cut the unreleased game Maximum Surge into a straight-to-video mess called Game Over. An apt title, at least. The rights were then sold on to a Hollywood special effects company called Flash Filmworks, who, despite being a surprising buyer, have been quite intelligent with them, and they released remastered versions onto the PC and all current consoles in partnership with Limited Run Games and Screaming Villains. The 25th anniversary version of Night Trap even includes the original scene of the crime demo. Time has been less kind to the interactive movie genre as a whole. It's essentially been dead since before the millennium, although I guess you could technically credit the recent wave of walking simulators like Gone Home and What Remains of Edith Finch to their lineage. The only recent true interactive movies I recall are the thought-provoking Her Story and the utter insanity bundle that is Press X to Not Die. The interactive movie once felt like the future, but in hindsight it was really just a momentary stopgap until we could do 3D properly. There's another example in this very issue, the Psygnosis 3D human body shooter Microcosm. The Sega CD was the lowest spec machine it got launched on, and it shows. It's literally a video with sprites pasted on to shoot, and it's a great example of the lazy way to do an early 3D game. It's kind of a shame this is what people remember of this period rather than the digital picture stuff that, good games or not, certainly had the effort put in. Now this technically isn't the gaming hell of this issue, but there's a few reasons I want to look at it. Firstly, while we've looked at a couple of football games in this series, they were all bloody good. In fact, they still are. This wasn't. The 19% Mega gave it would have comfortably won Gaming Hell in most of our other episodes. Secondly, it's a game I remember well, but never played. Pele was only released in the UK as an exclusive to the game store chain Future Zone. If you're one of those young people I've heard so much about, then you won't remember Future Zone. But they were popular in the UK during the time that calling a shop Future Zone wasn't cringingly embarrassing. They were bought by Electronics Boutique and ultimately became Game. The High Wycombe store I used to frequent far too much still had Future Zone stickers out the back when I worked there a decade later. And so on many of those visits I'd see copies of Pele at a slightly suspiciously cheap £20 for a new game, and with big Future Zone exclusive stickers on them. This was always slightly intriguing, but since I already owned Sensible Soccer, and Striker, and Sega's World Cup 90, and ISS Pro, and too many others, I never thought to buy it, and kind of wondered what I'd missed out on until I forgot about it entirely for 25 years or so before I opened Mega for this episode. In hindsight, launching at half price, being exclusive to one retailer, and, come to think of it, the fact there always used to be the same number of copies in every time I visited, should all have been clues to its likely quality. Since I'd forgotten about the game, despite having had every Mega Drive game on my hard drive for probably a couple of decades as I write this section, I've never played Pele. Something we shall now fix. Well, there's not a lot wrong here. That's a decently crafted intro for a Mega Drive game. Actual video is a really nice touch. The music is suitably jolly. One thing though, have they hired a dog to impersonate a crowd? I've always been a fan of Accolade, although given their one Yesterzine appearance was Speed Racer, I understand if you're not. Radical 2 were very new here, but went on to write some rather excellent stuff, such as Simpsons Hit and Run and the recently remastered Crash Tag Team Racing. This demo doesn't look too hideous either, with its flipped but FIFA-style isometric view. There's no map or clock like FIFA either, and it's no smarter a decision here than it was there. That said, it's solid looking, it's moving pretty well. The goal celebrations aren't TV-like as they are in FIFA, but it's still relatively engaging and pulls out those video clips again. The biggest problem I have so far is it gives the impression of being FIFA, but slightly worse. In 1994, we should remember that it was also half the price, and given how new FIFA was, there wasn't today's FIFA but slightly worse option, which is to walk into CEX and buy last year's game for less than $5 about a week after the new one comes out. I wonder if this game was rushed, because here's a slight lack of care that would be a result of that. In the options menu, changing between 1 and 2 players, you press left or right, but you change the match time by pressing up and down. It certainly is cheap looking. We've got a few fake club teams per country, and for England it includes Manchester. Which one, you ask? Both! Right down to having a striped red and sky blue kit. Fans might know better, but I didn't recognise more than a couple as being obscured versions of period players for either club, which could even be coincidence. The game itself is 3-button. We've got short and long kicks, basically a lob, a pass and a shoot. You have to be pretty explicit about directing a pass for it to connect, but it's not too bad at all. What I did find is it's curiously difficult to actually shoot in the direction of the goal, almost as if the game isn't quite sure if it wants to be up the screen or up the pitch, being up most of the time. The overriding feeling here is indeed that what we're playing is Poundland FIFA. And in those circumstances, I feel 19% is fairly hideously harsh. If you couldn't afford the 45 quid for FIFA, then this isn't a bad shot for 20 quid, if you really didn't want a more arcade-focused experience like Sensible. Now though, it's a different story of course. Because what you do is play any of the 5 Mega Drive FIFAs, at least 4 of which are more common than your mum's phone box adverts. There's not even any Pele reason to play this. His involvement is superficial at best, and they've very much not taken advantage of the license to put in things like his greatest teams, or scenarios based on his career, either of which could have elevated it to something worth you taking a look at given the solid enough game engine. 19% was really harsh on Pele in 1993, but now? It's probably exactly right. Which is a very neat conclusion that unfortunately means we've reached the point of the show I've been dreading. Okay, brace yourself folks, because our gaming hell this month is Japanese import-only Mega Drive title Ultraman. It's not got a lot of competition for the title because it was reviewed and got 1%. 1%. I'm not looking forward to this. Ultraman is a very Japanese superhero, first seen in a 1966 TV series. He's virtually unknown outside Japan, but is huge in his native market. At one point, Ultraman was the world's 3rd best-selling licensed character, despite having basically one market. The premise couldn't be more Japanese if the character's name was Tokyo Mangachan. Ultraman is an Ultra Warrior, a 40-metre tall punchy death machine who fights monsters. Unfortunately, his superpowers apparently don't include driving. On a visit to Earth, he accidentally collides with, and kills, anti-alien science patrol officer Shin Hayata. No, not you, Shin. Police Officer Shin.
I'll be who I want.
Feeling bad for killing Shin, he merges their bodies together, and Ultraman essentially becomes an alter ego. Shin, being a person of little imagination, continues his day job, morphing into Ultraman whenever there's room in the special effects budget. The show was commissioned by Tokyo Broadcasting System, better known today as the production company behind Takeshi's Castle and Sasuke, which you probably know better by its Western name, Ninja Warrior. It's a Monster of the Week show, as Ultraman does various punchings against aliens and monsters that threaten Japan. It may not remotely look it from the footage, but they tried to do this stuff right. The fights were choreographed by Haruo Nakajima, better known for playing Godzilla for the first 12 films in the franchise, and a man so important to the series that the 2019 Hollywood film Godzilla King of the Monsters is dedicated to his memory. As you might guess, with Japanese character lore, it gets a little complex from this point, with multiple Ultramen, multiple Ultra series, and even multiple Ultra universes. As far as I can tell though, Ultraman the Mega Drive game is set in the original universe, so we can stop here, and unfortunately, we're going to have to play the game. And we're going to start by me just playing you this intro. Yeah. And so we get into the kind of monster battle that's directly taken from the series itself, presented as a 2D fighting game. Now, to set the scene, it's vital to realise that both Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter 2 had long been released on the Mega Drive by this point, because that's the level of competition we're dealing with here. Let me point out the first issue. To jump, you press the C button. That's one of your buttons gone to a control literally every 2D fighter I have ever played maps to up. Beyond that, you have a kick and a punch button. Neither of them are super effective. I got some traction with repeated crouch and throw type moves, but even then this game starts hard. Standard moves will be countered easily by Ian Monster here, who can pluck you out of the sky like that other, legally distinct monster does with planes. Part of that, of course, is it controls like a coma patient. It's a very sluggish game, and Ultraman feels less like a superhero and more like your granddad in tights, albeit a little less horrifying. He moves around this screen like his knee is giving him jib, and punches like his arthritis is acting up. And that's about it. I didn't think we'd find a worse monster game than Super Godzilla from Episode 2, but the fighting in this is even worse. At least you don't have to tramp through the town first, I guess, but conversely, at least Super Godzilla had a frame rate that wouldn't have a ZX Spectrum yelling, "Is that all you've got?" I don't feel you miss out on much though. I didn't get beyond the first couple of rounds before my hands rebelled and refused to press the buttons anymore. But the aptly named Mad Matty at World of Longplays did get through the whole thing, which takes all of about 25 minutes by the way. At which point, the final monster kills you anyway, and then whatever this is happens. The best bit about this is they couldn't be bothered to do an animation of Ultraman flying away, so he just flies backwards out of the screen as they reverse his starting animation. It's fitting somehow. There's so little gameplay in Ultraman that it was recently voted Game of the Year by Homeopathic Gamer magazine. Literally the most enjoyment I got was realising the default high score table is populated with characters from the TV series. The game didn't get a release outside Japan, which does at least mean you're not accidentally going to pick it up at your next car boot sale. And that, mercifully, is where it's time to end. Our BackPage ad this week is for Reheated Pixels, the YouTube adventures of longtime retro gamer Pete Prodge, a stand-up gentleman in at least 2 respects. More specifically, we point you at his attempt to play every version of Outrun he could get his hands on. Imagine On What Should I Play, but done by a man with actual production talent and a face that isn't for radio. Also, he pisses off far-right shock jock radio hosts, and that's a pastime we can get right behind. We also extend thanks to Learned Rob of 81632-bit. By coincidence, he released a video on early FMV games while we were in the process of scripting this episode, and we certainly learned a little something. If you want 8 minutes more on that sort of thing, we suggest you pay him a visit. A link will magically appear on screen in about 30 seconds time. For more existential nightmares, subscribe to this very channel, and remember, only the best people also click the bell icon, which is the one that does the thing that most people would call subscribing. Bless YouTube, the chubby funsters. If you want to audition to be the next Ultraman, talk to us at these fine locations, or crash your ship into the comments below. And until next time, we'll be in Texas. Or someone's gut. We can't actually tell which. See ya!